Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Building Bigger Lives podcast. I'm Michael Regan, once again with my fabulous co-host, Kathryn Peterson. And as we often do, today we are again welcoming a guest onto the podcast. And our mission in bringing guests is always the same. We want to bring entrepreneurial and self-leadership voices into the mix of our conversation so that you, the listener, get the benefit of hearing different perspectives from some folks that maybe you've heard from before, maybe you've heard of before, but often these are folks that we notice are operating with a high level of effectiveness and maybe haven't sought as much of the spotlight, and we want to make sure we get a few moments to put it on them. So today, I'm going to turn the spotlight on one of my favorite people in the coaching world, Greg Harkavy. And Greg joins us as a going on 30-year veteran with Building Champions, but his legacy at Building Champions is only part of the context. He also, like Kathryn and I, has spent many years in the housing industry working on the mortgage side of the business prior to becoming a full-time coach. And so he brings this unique mix of both experience and legacy of those coaching sessions over the last several decades. And I want to tap into those because most folks that are familiar with Building Champions are quite familiar with where we tend to start, and that's with life planning. And I don't know that we always get the opportunity to discuss the why behind that. We all focus on the what, and I'm hoping Greg will help us today unpack the why. But without rambling further, Greg, welcome into the mix. We're so happy to have you today.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming, my friend. You are one of those folks that I think our audience will understand quickly why we brought you in. But could you give us maybe a little background just for those who might not be aware of your background because they haven't had the pleasure of meeting you or working with you? I set it up with a high level, but tell us a little bit about how you got to all of this experience with Building Champions.
Yeah, well, if we can go in the Wayback Machine, let's go back to 1990. I was a college graduate and I was going to become an attorney. And somebody that we all know and love, Daniel Harkavy, who happens to be my brother, was in the mortgage industry at the same time. I was going to be an attorney. I watched his career track go in the mortgage industry and I decided to join him. And I treated it like an MBA since I was not going to go to law school. Like, I'm going to give this mortgage thing 2 years. No judgment. I'm going to work as hard as I can. We'll evaluate whether or not this thing's for me. Well, I came from in 1990, like breadth was life. Like having balance was such an important thing to me. And then I said, I'm going to give 2 years of everything I have into the mortgage industry. It became almost the singular thing in my life. So I went from a place of understanding balance to being extremely out of balance, all in the name of success. I was working 7 days a week, suit and tie, calling on real estate offices, probably 60 calls a day, like in person. And that was kind of the beginning of how I got into this. Daniel then went on to form Building Champions a few years later, and he became my coach. And at that point in time, I was an out of balance workaholic. And he enters in and he becomes my coach. So this topic is huge for me because I was willing to give everything I had to make the business successful, but I didn't realize I was giving up my life for it. So,
All right. So before we leave the Wayback Machine, I just want to dig into that. So what was happening in that shift between your aspiration for the law and this opportunity to produce, having seen maybe what your brother was doing and getting involved? How did you find yourself so quickly thrown out of balance in the pursuit of success? Was that something that just happened before you knew it, or were there some steps along the way?
yeah, to say it fairly easily, how life came in college, and that path was never a challenge for me. I got into the mortgage industry, and all of a sudden it was a challenge, and I realized it would take everything I could give it. There were no boundaries necessarily for the business. So as I was pursuing success, and we talk about Lencioni's convictions, if you will, of hungry, humble, and smart. There was never any doubt that I was hungry. Humble at that age, questionable, maybe had some people smarts, but I was hungry. So I was willing to work really hard. So I think it crept up on me because I'd never actually experience something that had no boundaries. Like I built a school schedule in college around my surfing. I made sure that I could do classes in such a way that I would be able to surf 2 times a day, 7 days a week. So that was like everything was easy to do balance. And then I got into this business and I was like, oh no, you're gonna have to grind. At least so I thought. So I was probably working harder than smarter at that point.
Kathryn, I've got to think some of that you can relate to. Is that fair?
Yes, definitely. And I think that you bring up a good point that there's this dichotomy of, is it possible to have both balance and give a career everything you can? And maybe everything isn't the right word, but all you can. And I kind of think that there is. So let's maybe dig into that a little bit more of, how did you back up from that and say, okay, what steps do I need to take to put some sort of boundary on it? What's my new surfing going to be? And I love the background for those listening. We have Greg surrounded by waves and surfboards and a surf van, let's call it. Anyway, so it's fitting the motif. So give us a little insight into that.
Well, I would have to say that we're talking about life planning.
Mm-hmm.
Life planning was the intersect or even the interject that was the disruption for me. So this point in time, I want to share a little bit of my story. I had goals in life. I remember coming out of school, I went to UC Irvine, lived in Newport Beach, and I thought it'd be pretty cool to own a beach house in Newport by the time I'm 50. Well, that happened at 25, and I had like a Mercedes in the garage, and I'm thinking this is cool. I've arrived. And then the market crashed. And all of a sudden, what I thought was going to be this pinnacle thing became bondage, right? My income was down by about 40%. I'd spent most of my cash on this bank owned repo in this house in Newport Beach. It's really cool. It was a cool location. And I thought it was going to be a lifestyle to share with my friends, but I wound up being so stressed. I was working even more, making less, trying to make ends meet. And I'm like, there's got to be more than this. So that point in time also, and this was what I would consider divine timing. I met my wife of now 28 years back then. She was my fiance at the time. And Daniel, as my coach, said, hey, Greg, I want you to go take a day and create your life plan. And he made me do it during the week. Like, even though I was working 7 days a week, it was very specific. I want you to do it during a weekday. I'm like, God dang, are people going to think I'm goofing off? Our loans can be stuck in underwriting and maybe getting suspended and declined, and my team's trying to reach out to me. Our realtors reaching out to me to maybe pre-qualify some of their borrowers, or like I'm thinking all these things. There's no way I can take a day off. But it was like, I got permission because my coach told me I had to do this. I wouldn't have given myself permission to do that. That's kind of where I was at. So that was the interject, if you will. So is it okay if I just kind of continue the story of what that day was like for me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Please.
So as we do in coaching, we ask our clients to go find a place that might be inspirational, different. Like, you can't do this at the office, don't do it at the house. So I found a spot nearby at the beach, but I went to a more remote place where I knew I wouldn't run into people that I might know. And I can still remember that day. Like, I remember the direction my beach chair faced. I remember what the wind and the waves were like. But what I remember is, like, maybe the first hour and a half, I couldn't do the exercise. All I could think about is those things. Like, are people trying to reach me? Am I losing deals? Like, that was like a concern. And I'm like, hour and a half in, I'm like, this is dumb. If I can't focus on me for a day, if people won't appreciate that, then something's really wrong. And as soon as I kind of started unplugging all those little stimuli, if you will, that we're attached to all the time, I got into the exercise of life planning, and it started to flow. Like, there was passion and creativity. First exercise, if people don't know, is to write your eulogy as if you died today. And that really got me going. So after that day, I had pages and pages on a legal note. Like, back then, we didn't have a neat tool like you have today. It was just on a legal form. And I came home and I shared it with Rachel, and she saw what I wrote and she started to cry. That's when I knew. That's when it hit me. She saw how hard I was working. but she saw what I wanted and it inspired her. And at that moment, I said, I will fail my business before I will fail this life plan and fail this beautiful woman. And that was the pivot point for me. This is where it's like, okay, get your priorities in order. But this is the thing that I want to make sure that hits. This is a business strategy as well. Because what happened next became a galvanizing force for what I was actually doing with work. So I'm going to pause there before I go further into the story.
Well, great inclination, because I both want to capture something you just said, but I do want to take that last statement and flip it forward. I'm picturing this is in the early 90s, Greg. Is that about the right time frame? I don't know if you remember the year.
96.
Okay, got it. Okay, mid 90s. So these stimuli, was this a pager? What were we turning off at this moment?
Definitely a pager. In fact, I had two. If people ask like how I met my wife, I met her at TGI Fridays one night. I got her phone number and my buddies took it. It was on a cocktail napkin. They took it and put it in a glass of water. So I had to ask her again. I said, in case they do something again, I'm going to give you my phone numbers. I gave her two different pager numbers, my fax number, my office, my home number. She had like 5 numbers. So there were multiple stimuli. You know?
Yeah, of course, knowing Rachel today, she's thinking, what in the world does this guy do that he needs 5 numbers to get a hold of him?
Yeah, totally.
So, okay, now you're flipping this forward, Greg. And this is where I think Kathryn and I really were excited to talk to you, because those experiences that you had personally at some point created the shift for you that then became a multiplier that lots of other people got to benefit from. But I'm assuming before you were a coach, that experience is already cascading around you with real estate agents, with other loan originators, with maybe some other friends that you have. What was that season of life like when you first realized I can take control of my life? Were you like this Energizer bunny? Were you preaching the gospel, or were people like, what a weirdo, stay away from him?
Yeah, I don't think it was any of those. I think it was something that I had to lead by example, right? Let the fruit show itself. And so for the shift for me, it was a change in convictions and priorities, right? So what I didn't share with people was that I had made a choice. I was going to figure out how to make this business fund my life rather than my life fund the business. And that was the big pivot. So where people started to see that I was becoming different is they realized that I was being pretty militant with what I was available for and what I was not. Right. So there's this conviction of boundaries. There was a conviction of no wasted time when I showed up for work, because I knew what the trade-offs were. I was not going to compromise what I'd identified as important in my life plan. So I better figure out how to make the business work while I was there. There's a really cool CD series that Todd Duncan put out that I'll share as well that hit the nail on the head for me.
Okay, well then, if this is part of that glimpse, I want to know. So, as you recognize that there's a value in this exercise as a business strategy, and you're beginning to figure out how to make that shift and make that change, were you did you struggle for a while, Greg, or was the change pretty immediate?
I think the change was there, but the conflict was so obvious for me. Like that's where it became really aware to me of all the stuff that I had allowed, bad habits, if you will. Like as soon as I finished the life plan, if I was going to create a business that was going to support it, I had to deal with all the inefficiencies and everything else that I had created in my business. So the shift was there, but the conflict didn't go away yet.
Oh, I love that, because I think by putting some boundaries on your day, it can really point out, hey, this is what I have to do to make this time frame work so that I can live my life plan after 5 or whatever that boundary is for you. So kind of talk us through how you struggled through that a little bit and what that looked like, and maybe a couple of the things you implemented that really changed that time frame in that day.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest shifts for me is learning how to say no, but with a really purposeful why behind it. Right. Like I had to understand what my schedule needed to look like. And I was referencing the Todd Duncan CD. It was called New Paradigms on Balanced Living.
Mm.
And I think this might be a direct quote, but it's pretty darn close. He said, here's the new paradigm. Here's the shift. Work is what you do with the time you have left over after doing life. And that was a shift, right? But since I had clarity on what my life plan was, I now identified what I had left over to do work. My schedule looked very different than it did in the past. Oftentimes I couldn't even tell my wife how many hours I'd be working. Wasn't sure that day. I might get home at 10 o'clock and I'd leave at 7 in the morning, or something else. But, when we started having kids, if I didn't have a boundary, that'd be a problem, right? So that sort of shift was understanding what did my schedule and routine need to look like. And if I knew that, I knew how many hours I actually had left over to do work, then I didn't mess around with them. But quite frankly, if you're working 12 to 14 hours a day, I don't know about other people, you start to economize. You're not as efficient as you think you are because you're like, I've got all day. I can kind of mess around, or I need breaks. I would justify, since I'm working so many hours, I would need these breaks that were non-productive. But when I had clarity on what my priorities were in my life, I'm like, okay, so I'm choosing not to do that priority that I have written down for doing something non-productive that is actually a conflict to that. So when I started to see that, that was a huge shift for me for boundaries. I had to have boundaries with my teammates. I had to have boundaries with my referral partners and my borrowers, because if I was going to protect the schedule, they needed to know when I was available and when I wasn't. I had to be reliable. Like, hey, if you will trust me and when I'm available, that I'll do everything and more that you hope or need in exchange for the time that I won't be available. Like, they had to trust that I had a system in place that would give them the service that they deserved.
These are such important stories for us to get you to share because, Kathryn and I have met you during the season in which you're already well into your career as a coach, but you're telling us the stories about what it was like to do what both of us had to do, which is you've drafted the plan. Now you got to figure out how to live it. You've got to figure out how to make it work. And it's so good for people to listen and hear and see that, oh my gosh, Greg had to figure this out too. This wasn't just, oh, you're Daniel's brother. This was probably easy for you. If anything, maybe harder.
I felt like I was such a slow learner. I had the contrast of the other people Daniel coached. So I felt like I was a late bloomer, slow learner. Never was in school, but in life, I felt like, why is this taking me so long? Why is success seemingly harder and I'm not getting there as fast? It was interesting for me. It took a while to all lock in, but I think it's because I didn't have convictions that were driving me the same. I was spread too wide.
Kathryn, I'm tempted to take, Greg called it the Wayback Machine, to give us some context for this. I want to do some flash foresight because you and I were not that long ago in a room with Greg where if we were to call these bookends, the other end of this story is now Greg has a couple of decades of experience as a coach, and we got to hear him talk about his inspiration around where those of us are that are now thinking about what is the legacy we get to leave from all these years we poured into our career. Kathryn, you and I have worked together for a while. You've poured a lot of time into that. Tell me where your head goes with Greg here to ask questions, because when we sat in that room, I kept thinking this is the topic more people need to be thinking about. And I was so glad we were both there with him.
Yeah, so I think that the life plan changes so much over time, and it becomes where you have these little kids at home that you want to be able, I remember something on my life plan was sit on the floor and play with Abby, and now she's 16. And if I sat on the floor with her, she'd be like, are you going to be able to get up, mom? So, so things like that just adjust over time. And I think now there's a really weird perspective with so many people who started with a life plan 20 years ago, let's call it 15 years ago, who now are saying, wait a minute, now I'm in this other area of my life. And it did help me to think through that a little bit with the legacy of the life plan. And so I love that you're here and we're talking about this because it's a little bit of a flipped script, but in a good way, because it's saying, hey, I still have a life plan just because I'm a little bit older. It just looks different. And now I'm pouring into some other things. So talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah. What's written in the life plan today looks very different than it did back then. Like those things that you're talking about, our kids get older, we get older. Some of our values and priorities shift, right? So even the eulogy, that probably gets updated the least over my 20 plus years. I mean, since 96 of that first draft. But this past year, I updated my eulogy again because there was some stuff that was just dated in there. It wasn't the same as we do get older. And then, if you remember kind of what was hitting me when we were together in San Diego was the fact that most of us in the room had more in the rearview mirror than we did in the windshield. Like dealing with that reality, the tape measure exercise and how many like really good cognitive years we may have left.
Mm-hmm.
I started life planning at a very young age, honestly. When you're writing things like a eulogy, it seems so far out. When you start attending more and more memorials with your friends that are of a similar age, and you start to realize that tomorrow's not promised, you kind of get it intellectually when you're younger if you're somewhat in tune. But when it starts hitting with a deeper reality, like, oh boy, okay, another shift, right? We start living for different things and hopefully more purposeful things, right? Most of that's going to be outward. So when you think about the legacy, one of the biggest shifts is we're no longer living for ourselves. Like I don't even call my life plan anymore. This is maybe on a more personal note, but I deeded my life over to God many years ago. So it's not my plan. It's his will for my life. Like I hope this is what it is. How do I care and love people becomes a much bigger driver as far as like the legacy today. Yes, I still want to take care of my health because I want to be vibrant for those people that I want to be in relationship with. Yes, things like finances are still important, but you start to realize, okay, relationships, your impact on your community, who you get to serve in business, everything starts to be like, I only have so much time left. And this is not a morbid thing. It's just actuaries will tell us the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Our time is starting to count even more.
Greg, this is a powerful topic, and I'm just tempted to go down so many layers of it. But I think for some of our audience who are, let's just presume, in a version of their season of life, maybe 20, 30 years into a career, maybe they've, like you and Kathryn and I, they've attempted life planning as a strategic tool for part of that business that they've been managing, or maybe they're new to this idea and it's an opportunity for them to not assume that it's too late and to, in fact, put that marker in the ground. Regardless of where they are, you really helped us in that room say it doesn't so much matter whether you're new to this or old to this. It's the years you have remaining, that the trajectory of what is ahead of you will be a huge component in the legacy that you lead. And I think for all of us, whether it's with kids, whether it's with our family and friends, whether it's with our coworkers, at some point we're going to be remembered. And I know that was a powerful part of what you were sharing with this audience. What's the big takeaway for someone listening today who is maybe realizing I've spent my whole career climbing the ladder? Oh man, I hope I leaned it up against the right wall.
Yeah. I always want to be mindful that I don't know somebody's journey when I'm speaking to somebody until I walk in their shoes a little bit. So something that just hit me with that, and it's maybe an indirect response to getting to your question. I went to 6 memorials last year. I've been to dozens. And something shifted even my perspective last year is I felt like I had the privilege to see somebody's life fully lived out and hear what was the legacy. Some of them were fantastic. Some of them were kind of not maybe what you would hope, right? There was messiness that was left on the table, if you will. And having the privilege of the seat of that, to see what's actually going on, is a huge driver for me. Right. So when I look at what ladders are you putting on, I don't know if it matters what business you're in. It's understanding what your priorities are now. Where do you want your legacy? Kathryn, I thought you said it perfectly. Like when we were younger, our life plan had different objectives. Sitting on the ground with our young ones versus at 16, things change. Well, also like what we consider balance. Like I don't even use that word as a coach anymore. I talk about integration, because our seasons change. What might have required balance 15 years ago might look different today. Right. So it's understanding more, how are we integrated? Yeah. And with that, I mean, I don't know if it's directly answering your question, Michael, but like knowing if we have regrets, if we're not taking care of what's most important to us, because in the name of pursuit of our career, well, if you're in the later stages of your career and you're not sure if you're spending it where you need to, you have to take a pause, and you have to reflect, and you have to ask yourself, what am I trading my precious hours for now? Am I not present where I need to be? Do I feel like I'm using my gifts and talents in places that aren't really fully leveraged? Like those are questions, I think, when we think about what ladders we're putting on what walls, we need to know. It's like, are we making a difference? I don't want to begin to say, hey, this is the whole meaning of life, but I'm fairly confident in that answer is the impact we have on people and how we use our time to make a difference, right? There's something in that, in the meaning of life. So, later stages in our careers, that question doesn't go away. So it has to be addressed.
Kathryn, this is, when I think of meeting you 10 years ago at an event, by the way, that Greg was attending as well, our Building Champions experience. And I'm not sure if I used this quote, but just Greg is bringing back this thought to my mind as I thought about this with any new client I met. I might have looked at you and said, here's one thing I know for sure. I don't want to meet Todd someday and have him look at me and say, I really don't know what you were doing coaching my wife. I don't understand it. Great. She won a bunch of awards. Great. She was a top producer. Great. We made money, but we never see her anymore. And she's not fun to be around anymore. Like, that's not a win for me. A win for me is when he says, I really don't know what you do, but I'm married to a woman who just gets better and better over the years, both personally and professionally. That's what I shoot for with a client. And hearing Greg riff on that, it inspires me again as a coach to think this is our legacy as coaches. We get to have that kind of opportunity to have those very conversations with people. So, Kathryn, I'm going to let you bring us home today. I could keep rambling because I love this topic, but bring us into a close.
So what I want people to do is go back and listen to the questions Greg just asked a few times and maybe write down a few, because those were, I was like a sponge, if you could see me. So, what are you doing that, he said it best. So I'll just let you guys rewind and write those down, but really, really listen to those, because those were huge as I was kind of going through them in my brain. And I'm now excited to go back to my life plan and maybe redo a few more things, even though I just did it. So I think those are questions that once you have a life plan written, Michael always says it's written in pencil, not in pen. Go back to it, ask some of these questions to yourself, and holy cow, this has been a powerful podcast. So, Greg, thank you so much for all the lives that you've influenced and the life of mine that you've influenced, and all the great questions that you're asking. Because I think the life planning process has also changed. And the life plan now also is making a legacy. So I think it's great to have you here to go through that with us. So thank you so much for being here. Michael, any last questions, thoughts?
Greg, I just want to say thank you as well. And let's put at least a reminder to the audience out there that as we continue to invest in the legacy, what's your mindset? Like, if you could sum up as a coach who's not hanging up his cleats yet, not ready to be finished with working with leaders yet, what's that one thing you hope they hear from Greg Harkavy today?
Yeah, I think one of it is the life plan. We don't serve it, it serves us, right? So that's one of the things that I want to make sure, because this can start to feel like duty and obligation and bondage. It's not, it's a tool. It's something to help us be intentional, right? So that is the main thing I want people to realize is it really is our friend. I think people sometimes are afraid of it because they're like, oh man, I'm going to have a bunch of to-dos and I'm going to have to look in the mirror and ask, did I do what I said I was going to do? That's all noise. If you can remember, like life planning at the end of the day is about being intentional and purposeful with what's most important to you. It's going to impact every area of your life, including your business. So, this is not a extra thing. It is, I think, core to also showing up every day as the best leader, originator, whatever your role is. It's kind of the performance enhancement of what's going to make everything else work. So look at it as an enhancement more than anything else.
And I love that. It's there for you to use it. It's not there to burden you. And you said it really clearly. I hope our audience heard that. Greg, really wonderful to have you here today. Will you come back again? Can we bring you back into the fold in a future date?
As long as you don't get a bunch of people saying, never have that guy, and I might just show up.
Yeah, fair enough. Kathryn, we'll keep track of all the naysayers just in case Greg needs to add those up. Folks, this is a wrap again on Building Bigger Lives. Today's podcast was really for you. If you are a person of leadership, whether you're leading a couple of people or a whole organization or somewhere in between, if life planning has ever been a topic you've been interested in, I hope we made you curious to go dig in and find out more about what it is, because we focused more on the why we do it. And I hope that intrigued you. If it did, go check out buildingchampions.com. Our website has plenty of information available on not just some free resources that you can use, but also how to get a hold of us as an organization if we can help you walk through that exercise as well. Kathryn, great to be with you again today. Greg, I will see you again soon, and I hope you will catch us on another episode of Building Bigger Lives. Have a great day.